Okay, so we're going to read tonight from Genesis chapter 5, which if you have the church Bible is on page 4. Shouldn't be too hard to find. Only have to flick over a few pages. So we're going to read from Genesis 5:28 through to chapter 6, verse 8. So Genesis 5:28. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son. He named him Noah and said, "He will comfort us in the labour and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." After Noah was born, Lamech lived 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Lamech lived a total of 770 years, and then he died. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground. For I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favour in the eyes of the Lord."
Good evening. So if you've got your Bibles open, it'd be good to follow along as we look at these verses together from Genesis 5 and 6. The sons of God. Yes, the title tonight comes from chapter 6, verse 2. Where we're told that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. But before we get to chapter 6, verse 2, let's see where we've got to so far in the book of Genesis. We've come through the creation in chapter 1. We've come through God's relationship with man in chapter 2. We've come to the fall in chapter 3. And now in chapters 4 to 11, which is the next significant chunk of Genesis, we see the pattern of sin, judgment, and grace that was established in chapter 3. We see that pattern repeated 3 more times before the call of Abraham. So in chapter 3, with Adam and Eve, there was the sin committed, followed by judgment, yet God in his grace allows them to live and have children, and they continue to rule and subdue and fill the earth. Sin, judgment, and grace. And that threefold pattern continues 3 more times between chapters 4 to 11. The first time is the Cain and Abel account, where there's the sin of murder, the judgment on Cain, yet God in his grace preserves a godly line of descendants from Seth. And secondly, we see it in the account of Noah, where we see human wickedness increasing, bringing the judgment of the flood. Yet by grace Noah is chosen and God makes a covenant with him. And then finally in chapters 10 and 11 in the Tower of Babel, we see mankind in general opposing God, with not one dissenting voice raised against them. And God in judgment scatters them. Then in his grace he calls Abraham and makes a covenant with him. So you see the story of Genesis 3 is being repeated again and again and again, increasing sin, increasing judgment, and increasing measures of grace. That's really the story of mankind, down to the present day. A story of sin and judgment and grace. So again and again, God steps into the chaos of man's rebellion to ensure his purposes are fulfilled. The spread and intensification of sin and wickedness on the earth cries out for a resolution that only God can provide. Nothing is going to stop the downward spiral of sin and wickedness from Genesis chapter 3 all the way to chapter 6, verse 5, where every inclination of the human heart is only evil all the time. Nothing is going to stop that downward spiral unless God steps in, unless God intervenes. And as God steps in, he brings a resolution that comes in the form of the sons of God, culminating in the coming of the Son of God. So coming to chapter 5 of Genesis, which is our first genealogy, we discover in Genesis, and there's a number of genealogies in Genesis, and the significance of these genealogies is seen right really in the first 3 verses of chapter 5. This is the written account of Adam's line. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. He created him male and female and blessed them, and when they were created, he called them man. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. What the genealogy is telling us is that grace continues, life continues. Children are born in God's likeness. Yet the genealogies also tell us that judgment continues alongside grace as everybody dies. Death engulfs the whole human race. But not quite everybody. See in 5:24, Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. Everyone else dies. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 5. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. Before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. So here, in this genealogy of death, we have a suggestion and a hint of a greater measure of grace available for a man of faith, a grace sufficient to overcome curse and judgment and death. Could it be that within fallen mankind there could be one who triumphs over death? We're told twice in verse 22 and 24 that Enoch walked with God. He walked with God. Can the fellowship of the Garden of Eden be restored? Is it possible that fallen mankind could again walk with God? Well, the genealogy of Adam in chapter 5 is really a starting over for Adam. It's a beginning again. His son Cain was banished from God's presence and God's blessing. His son Abel is dead, and so Adam and Eve need another son. And so God gives them a son. He gives them Seth in place of Abel. And so the genealogy of Adam continues, this time with just one son, Seth. And as we see in the account, Adam had many sons and daughters. He continued to fill the earth. But it was through the son Seth that the genealogy comes down to Noah. So this line of Seth is a line of those who began to call on the name of the Lord. You see at the end of chapter 4. Seth also had a son and named him Enosh, and at that time men began to call on the name of the Lord. If you bear in mind that when this account was first written, there were no chapter divisions, there were no verse divisions, and so the narratives flow together with vital connection. And so the line of Seth, men who began to call on the name of the Lord, is now given to us in the genealogy of chapter 5 to prepare us for Noah, who came from the line of Seth, who came from the line of those who called on the name of the Lord, who came from the lineage of the godly Enoch, who walked with God. And so when we come down to verse 8 of chapter 6, from the line of Seth, Noah finds favour in the eyes of the Lord. Now, some of the names in the genealogy in chapter 5, the genealogy of Seth, some of those names also appear in Cain's genealogy in chapter 4. So in chapter 4 we have the genealogy of Cain, it's not a very long one, and then in chapter 5 we have the genealogy of Seth. They're kind of lying side by side there in the scriptures. And while some of the names are the same in both, they're not the same people. And many of these names we see in this genealogy of Seth. These names do not reappear in the biblical record. Well, only Noah and his family survived the flood. No others of the lineage of Seth and no others of the lineage of Cain survived the flood. And yet each in their own time and in their own way in Genesis 5, each of these names from the lineage of Seth play a vital role in advancing God's plan of redemption until a son is born who is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. Chapter 5, verse 28. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son. He named him Noah, and he said, "He will comfort us in the labour and painful toil of our hands, caused by the ground the Lord is cursed." After Noah was born, Lamech lived 595 years and had other sons and daughters, and altogether Lamech lived 777 years, and then he died. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, to us, these lifespans seem very long. And yet, when you look at chapter 3, verse 22, you realise, in fact, they're very short. In chapter 3, verse 22, God created man to live forever. So already, in order to limit the amount of wicked and evil that sinful people can do, God is shortening the lifespans. And we'll see in chapter 6, verse 3, that he will shorten them even further. So here in these verses at the end of chapter 5, we have the introduction to us of Noah. And at this point, there is a turning point in the narrative. As God introduces Noah to us, God is about to do something which we haven't seen coming. God, in his judgment, is going to return the earth to the watery, uninhabitable state of Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. This is going to be an undoing of creation. This is going to be a going back in order to start over, a going back to Genesis 1:2, so there might be a renewed separating of the water in the dry land. So there might be a starting over with one man chosen by grace. There might be a renewed mandate for Noah, the sole survivor, along with his family, and a covenant of commitment made with these survivors of the line of Seth. God is going to return creation to Genesis 1:2 in order to have a renewed creation. Here is the judgment of God on creation in order to have a new creation. Here is the judgment of God on mankind in order to have a new humanity. Here is the judgment of God on all that he's created in order that he might, through one man, raise up a new humanity of those who call upon him and who walk with him. Notice in chapter 5:29, the father of Noah indicated by his comments there that he was fully aware of the significance of the events recorded in chapter 3. And he was looking to the Lord to provide comfort and rest in the midst of painful and relentless toil. Unlike any of the line of Cain in chapter 4, who evidenced no sign of faith toward God. You see the contrast between these two lineages, these two lines of descendants? And so Noah was born of a godly lineage and ancestry. He was born of the line of Seth. And we're told in chapter 6, verse 9, that Noah also walked with God like his godly ancestor Enoch. When men began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. And the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years." The beginning of verse 1 there, when men began to increase in number on the earth. So we've just been given the line of Cain. We've just been given the line of Seth. Chapter 4, chapter 5, and now in beginning chapter 6, we're told that these two lines of descendants were increasing rapidly. And when you see the lifespans and you realize the potential for having progeny, you realize that in fact in 6:1 is telling us that there's a huge increase in the number of people on the earth, both of the line of Cain and of the line of Seth. And so the line of Cain and the line of Seth, the descendants of these two, were living and working together. And in time, these two lines began to intermarry with one another. God was not pleased with the marriage of the godly to the ungodly, so in verse 3, he shortened their lifespans and even more. The line of Seth, of those who called on the name of the Lord, were intermarrying with the line of Cain, whom God had cursed and banished from his presence. You see, the problem here in these three verses is not marriage itself. Marriage is not the problem here. It's whom they were marrying. So the term sons of God in verse 2 is used to identify and distinguish the sons of Seth over against the sons of other men generally, namely the line of Cain. We saw from the line of Cain in chapter 4 that men and women descended from Cain were without faith. But also we saw in chapter 4 that they still had significant cultural contributions to make to the general well-being of mankind. They built cities and they played instruments and they made tools. In chapter 4 we have that spelt out for us. But then when you come to chapter 5 and the line of Seth, nothing is said of the accomplishments of the descendants of Seth. By contrast, the line of Seth seems to contribute only men and women who walk with God and who by faith call upon his name. Now that distinction, of course, is not absolute. The line of Seth would have also worked with their hands and tilled the ground, but you see how it's being presented here in the scriptures. That there's a distinction here between the two, and the distinction is one of faith. These two genealogies are telling us something that's very significant for mankind generally, that dispersed among and within the culture and industry of unbelieving people are scattered those whose chief contribution is to walk with God and to call upon his name. They are the salt and the light. They are the sons of God in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation. Whatever contribution believers have to make with the work of their own hands. It is this mark of godliness that separates them out as a distinct and different line of men and women. They have a different genealogy. They are not of the genealogy of those who have been cursed and banished from God's presence. They have a different genealogy. They are the sons and daughters of the true and living God, who labour in the midst of an unbelieving generation, as did the descendants of Seth. And as they labour together, they are not to marry these unbelievers among whom they live and work. It is not to be expected that God will bless the marriages of godly people with ungodly people. The blessing of God is not to be expected on marriages between godly and ungodly people. Now just think for a moment, Moses was writing this account for the wilderness wanderers, those who had escaped from Egypt. And where were they heading for? There in the desert. 40 years of wandering, and where were they headed for? They were headed for a promised land inhabited by wicked and ungodly people. And what was the command that was given to them? When you get into that land, you must not intermarry with inhabitants of that land. They will turn you away from God. They will turn you away from walking with God. They will turn you away from a life of faith. And so as Moses was writing this account for those people and where they were headed, he gave them the example from the time of Noah that God is displeased when the godly descendants of Seth intermingle and intermarry with those who have no regard for God. As it was in the days of Noah, Moses is saying to his first readers, so it must be in your day when you come into the land that God is going to give you. Verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes or the giants of old, men of renown. Now, the word Nephilim is only mentioned twice in the Bible, here and in the book of Numbers, which we'll look at in a moment. And here in Genesis chapter 6, the Nephilim, which is can also be translated giant, but it probably became a word which, like a nickname, was a word that was used to describe or to refer to a class of a warrior class of giants who are highly regarded for their fighting powers. Now, all that verse 4 says is that these warrior class of people were already around when the events of verse 2 took place. And they continued to be around afterwards when the events of verse 2 took place. And the phrase there in verse 4, and had children by them, refers not to the Nephilim, but to the liaisons described in verse 2 between the descendants of Cain and Seth. So as I read verse 4, what it says to me is that during this time when the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth were intermingling and intermarrying, the Nephilim, or the giants, were there. And I think that word hero in the NIV is best understood as giant. They weren't necessarily people who were worthy of praise, because the very next verse, verse 5, tells us that they were included in those whose the inclination of their hearts was only evil all the time. So why are the Nephilim even mentioned here? Well, perhaps Moses wanted to make the point for his first readers that the Nephilim also perished in the flood. Where it says there, verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. Some take that to mean also after the flood. But my reading of verse 4, that they were there also before and after the time when these two lines were mingling, because nobody survived the flood except Noah and his sons and their families. So Moses was making the point for his first readers that the Nephilim, the giants, who perhaps were the participants and instigators of the wickedness described in verse 5, they may well have been the ringleaders, given the fear in which they induced in people's hearts. Moses wanted to show his first readers that these Nephilim, these giants, were dealt with by the Lord. And perhaps Moses had good reason for doing that, because in Numbers chapter 13, we have the account of the spies going into the land of Canaan. And the spies came back with a report, and their report was very negative. They said, the land is inhabited by giants. We are like grasshoppers in their sight. And the word they used for giant was Nephilim. It's like this word had survived. It had survived as a word to describe giant or warrior-like class of people who inflict fear and intimidation on their enemies. And as they came back with this report, and the heart of the people quailed, and they said, we cannot go up into this land because it's inhabited by giants. Moses was writing this account and saying, look, God dealt with the giants back then. In the time of Noah, he can deal with the giants now in our time. Perhaps that's why they got a mention in Genesis chapter 6. Verse 5. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind whom I have created from the face of the earth, men and animals and creatures that move along the ground and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them. But Noah found favour in the eyes of the Lord. In the midst of all that wickedness, God chose to set his grace and favour on one man, who would be the saving of all mankind. Salvation comes in the midst of judgment, in the one that God has chosen. God's gracious commitment to Noah and his family demonstrates his ongoing purpose to restore his image bearers and renew his creation by grace because of his love. Well, just a reflection by way of application as we finish up here. The work that mankind was given to do in Genesis 1 and 2 continues. There is still ground to be tilled, nature to be studied, described and named. Men and women must still be fruitful, must still multiply, must still govern. That's the task that's been given mankind. But now, as a result of Genesis 3, there's a second layer of work that must be added to that first layer. The work of healing, repairing, and restoring things that go wrong because of sin. So over here, the work of farmers and scientists and midwives and parents and leaders must now be joined over here by the work of doctors and funeral directors and corrections officers and forensic scientists and everyone in the professions that restrain evil and forestall disaster and repair damage and search and rescue and search and recover and those who restore health. You see, the two are now working together side by side, those who build up and those who repair what breaks down. And so over here, people build cars, and over here, people repair cars. You see, the two must go together because what is built up will break down and need repair. And so, you see, everyone's work is now a mixture of creation and repair, encouragement and frustration, success and failure, joy and sorrow. And so you buy a product, and part of the conditions of the sale is there will be an after-sale service. Well, why should there be an after-sale service? Why do we need an after-sale service? Because what has been produced and what you're purchasing is going to break down. And you're going to need someone to come along and repair it and fix it for you. We don't think of that as a result of the fall, do we? It's just become so much a part of daily living. A major workplace issue for many Christians as they work alongside the unbeliever is how to observe the principles that reflect God's will and purpose. In cases where our work pressures us towards dishonesty, disloyalty, low-quality workmanship, unlivable wages and working conditions, exploitation of vulnerable co-workers, customers, suppliers, or the community at large. Where others may fall into fear, uncertainty, and doubt under such pressures in the workplace, or succumb to the unbounded desire for power or wealth or human recognition, God's people can remain steadfast in ethical purpose, compassionate work. The sons and daughters of God who labour alongside the unbeliever. When people are abused or harmed by greed or injustice or hatred or neglect, we can stand up for them. Christians of all people can afford to push back against the sin we meet in our places of work, in our places of study, whether it arises from the actions of others or within our own hearts. Would the descendants of Seth survive as they work alongside the descendants of Cain? Only if God intervenes. Only if God steps in with preserving grace and enabling strength in judgment against evil. And so today the sons and daughters of God continue to walk with God in the midst of the ungodly, just as their godly ancestors of faith have done from the very beginning. And so we advance God's purposes in redemption among all mankind as we continue by faith to walk with Him while we're surrounded by those who have no regard for Him. And so we bear the salt and light. So we keep that light burning, that gospel light of hope and promise. As in our places of work and in our neighbourhoods, we are there as people who are distinctive by our walk with God. The descendants of Seth survived the flood in order to preserve a godly line that would ultimately produce the Lord Jesus Christ, to whom we are all united by faith. Praise God for the lineage of Seth. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you for this wonderful testimony of your scripture, how you stepped into such sin and wickedness and you chose Noah and set your grace and favour upon him, that he might be the means of a great redemption, a great salvation in the midst of judgment. And we thank you, Father, that ultimately in your purposes of redemption, you stepped into the wickedness of our world and you set your grace and favour upon the Lord Jesus Christ, who in the midst of the judgment that he bore, won a great salvation for us. And we thank you that as we walk with you day by day and strengthen our faith in you day by day, we can have that assurance and personal reality that in the Lord Jesus Christ we are able to be men and women of distinction, men and women of uniqueness, men and women who stand out as being different and yet one with. We ask, Father, that you would continue to help us to be those people who in our places of work and study and neighbourhood are able through the way we work and the way we love and the way we reach out to draw people in to the life of Jesus Christ as he is seen within us through our word, through our testimony, and through our distinctive living. We ask these things for Christ's sake and for his glory. Amen.